Hey everybody, in case you don't know who I am author S.A. Baz Collins, and I am a writer of queer speculative fiction, some romance, more queer romance than the MM that's out there now. But I wanted to do a series of videos to talk about my latest work, Were Mohawks Bearing Gifts, which is the first book of the Cove Chronicles series. The evolution of that series was born out of two things, really. A book that was titled The Journey of Silas P. Bigelow, which is an amazing book. If you've not read it, I highly recommend you seek it out. Really a lovely story, not very well known in literature, but I highly recommend you read it. It was kind of the impetus of my wanting to write about Native characters in a way that they haven't been written about, or at least that I haven't found in literature. So the Cove Chronicles really started when my granddaughter was born, and I decided, looking at her on her very first day of life, I wanted to write a story that had a female protagonist who could show girls in their teenage years that they can be more than what they've often been portrayed as, boy crazy and what have you. So I wanted to do something along those lines for her. So I started to write that story. And then I realized that a story that I had been working on previously that kind of had started to germinate was a story that was 300 years into the future, in a kind of, not necessarily dystopian way. It actually is after the fall of the United States, and Native populations had regained some of the territories lost to them when the United States was formed. And I had written that story thinking, oh, this could be kind of interesting to play with Native themes and perspectives in a sci-fi kind of futuristic view. And then I realized that while I was writing the first, what I envisioned to be the first book of the Cove Chronicles series, I then realized that the futuristic story had a lot in common with the contemporary story I was setting in, today, the present, here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. So I thought about, well, if that's the case, then maybe I can tie these two together. And then I had to think about what I wanted to do to be the wellspring of that story. And since I was focusing on the Great Six Nations of the Iroquois, or as they like to refer to themselves, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which are the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Tuscarora, and Seneca. I decided to use their creation myth, and I did the what if. And to me, those are the two most powerful words to put together. They can apply to almost anything. And for me, they're kind of like the wellspring of imagination and the mother of invention. If we never asked ourselves, what if, then we might not have half of what we have in this world. So I decided to take that what if concept and I decided to apply it to my story. And I thought, well, taking the creation myth is really rather interesting because in several iterations of the story that are told amongst the different nations of the Haudenosaunee are the concept that there was this woman called Sky Woman, and she plummets to what will become Turtle Island here on our Earth. And she is at the essence, the beginnings of life on this planet. There is a variation in the stories where either she has a daughter and the daughter has twin boys, or I've seen it where Sky Woman has twin boys. But in either event, twin boys are born, and they couldn't be more different if they tried. They were named Osara and Sawaskira, which is spruce and flint. And they embody good and evil. Spruce is the virile one. He's the one with a beautiful complexion. He's got all this radiance of life and creation. He is the seed, the germination of everything. And then Flint is his pallid, kind of like sallow and sinewy brother. So he's the darkness. So the way the creation myth kind of goes is that, Spruce, continues his mother's work and creates, brings creation forward, and it's always beautiful, and it's very, very benign. It's very, very helpful. And so Skira goes about and perverts things. So like the gardener snake, the simple gardener snake is actually turned venomous, and that's how we have poisonous snakes. So that it's along those lines. He would take something that his brother created and then flip it and make it something that was menacing. So I decided to take that good versus evil thing, because it's been done in literature before, and I decided to start from there. So I retell in the prologue of the first book, which takes place actually in the 1800s. When I was writing the contemporary one, I realized I was writing so much backstory, I had to go back and actually write what happened. So that's why the first book, Were Mohawks Bearing Gifts, takes place in the 1800s. And it takes place in a world that is like ours, but is not ours. It's actually a parallel universe. And the reason why I don't wanted to do this was not because I wanted to completely dismantle Haudenosaunee culture for the story. In fact, I was trying to protect it. So what I did is, because I wanted to do the what if Sawasquira and Osara are real, and Sky Woman is real, and the battle of good and evil that comes from it is real, what could I do with that from a native perspective? And one of the things I wanted to play with was the old Arthur C. Clarke quote of, I'm paraphrasing it here, but, technology that's not understood is indistinguishable from magic. So I wanted to thread that element through it. And I thought, okay, if I take it and I make it about Spruce and Flint, the twins that are at each other, that are at war with each other, and if I evolve that and push that into the people, I could explain the animosity that existed with the Haudenosaunee before they became the Confederacy. I could play into that. And then I thought, well, I want to make this a little more grand. Well, one of the things in Haudenosaunee culture that's frowned upon is witchery and sorcery and all things supernatural like that. So I thought, okay, if I want to play with that and I want to be respectful of the culture, how do I do that? That was my biggest struggle. Well, then I having conversations with an author friend and my co-host on the Rope podcast, Van Sebastian, gave me the idea, why don't you just put it in an alternate universe? Then you can diverge wherever you want, you can keep with the parts you need, and you can kind of evolve some other things or play with them in a way that isn't disrespectful to what's here on this planet. So bear in mind, Were Mohawks Bearing Gifts is not this world. It is an alternate world where things didn't necessarily go the way they did here. So I decided to have Spruce realize that his fight with his brother was becoming unbearable. It was eating up too much of his time. So Spruce gifted he brought the people together, and I used the story of the Great Peacemaker, and I have Spruce return to the people as the Peacemaker. So I'm blending the creation myth with the story of the Peacemaker, which are two very sacred tales, and I had to be really careful about how I wanted to do it. But I decided the easiest path was just to simply say that Spruce returned to the people, but not as they remembered him. And that way I could weave in the story of the Peacemaker. And why that's important is because the Peacemaker is highly regarded in Haudenosaunee culture. It's kind of like Voldemort. They speak of his name with great reverence. So, I had to tread lightly here to make sure that I could use these elements but not misuse them. And I'm hoping, cross fingers, that I did it right. So the story is evolving between the Haudenosaunee people, who Spruce has decided he is going to have them become the guardians of the earth. And so I titled them the Guardians. I use a Mohawk phrase, but I titled them as the Guardians. So in the trade language of English, in my story and in my world, they actually call themselves the Guardians. And they're imbued with powers that allow them to play with matter and energy. And it seems like it's magic, but it's really just quantum mechanics that are in play. So I had to have something on the other side. So the Flintlings are, and it's a phrase that's coined from Flint by one of my protagonists in the first book. He ends up giving them the name the Flintlings. And the Flintlings actually have a thrust to where Flint has instructed his minions to embody what man fears most. So the whole crux of the weapons that the Flintlings use in this story are the nightmares of men and women. So the idea is that, ghosts, vampires, werewolves, things that go bump in the night that have scared humanity from the beginning are what these creatures play into. So you'll see vampires in my story, you'll see werewolves, you will see what I call ethereals, which are spiritually ghosty kind of things. But realize that really what they are these Flintling creatures who can embody and personify these nightmares for people. And when you put people in a fearful place, much like we are now, they tend to do things that are not quite so smart. So that's what the whole purpose of this story is. It's the fight of good and evil, but fear is the factor that everyone must overcome. The cast of main characters, and I don't want to make this video too long, but I do kind of want to go over just a little bit about what the story involves. So there is a quartet that are at the core of the first 3 books of the Cove Chronicles series. There's Joss Lightfoot, who is probably the most powerful guardian that's out there. And that's only because after he attained his guardianship, he went out into the wilds for 2 years after he left Dartmouth College, where he had been studying, which actually was traditionally a native college. And he went out into the wilds and started experimenting with his abilities and started creating journals that documented what he was doing. And you begin to realize as he explains things, and they call it the dark, and the reason why they call it dark, it's dark matter and dark energy, but they call it the dark because they can't see where that manipulation comes from. So they call it the dark. And Joss went out into the wilds and just experimented and wrote down scientifically all of the things that he played with and what his conclusions about it were. At that same school was William Hallett, who interestingly enough actually existed in real life. William Hallett was in this time period back in our U.S. history, and he's actually an ancestor of my husband's family. So I decided to use the Hallett family as not really the go-between, but kind of the path for non-natives to have access to a native culture. And it's told from his perspective, but it's told from his perspective because he's half British and he is half Haudenosaunee. He's half Mohawk. So this first book is partially kind of consumed with his embracing his culture, the Mohawk culture that he's always had in the background. It's always things that have been going on in his life, but Will has kind of forgotten about it. He's kind of gone on. He's now a dandy. He dresses in the most elegant fashions of the time, and he has a twin sister named Rebecca, and she's just as statuesque and just as beautiful, and they're kind of peacocks within the high Manhattan society at the time. But Will really hates his life. He doesn't want this kind of life. He wants an adventure. He wants something that is so wickedly adventuresome that it will satiate him for his entire life. And that comes in the form of Joss. He doesn't know it at the time when they reconnect. And it's also his best mate, who he was roommates with, who was also Mohawk, Jacob Lyons. And Jacob became involved while they were at school at Dartmouth with Will's sister, Rebecca. So they're at the core of this story. There are 2 other characters that I do want to bring up just momentarily. That is the characters of Thomas and of Tionaga. Thomas is the young boy who is introduced in the story, who has been kidnapped previously, about a year before this book begins. And it becomes part of the story of them trying to find Thomas, whom they still believe is alive. And in the course of their search for him, they run across Tionaga. Now, Tionaga is the voice of the prologue in the book, and that takes place in 1150. Tionaga is immortal, and there is a journey that he has been on that he's still grappling with to this day. So Tionaga is actually the character that is on the cover. He is the Mohawk Bearing Gifts, and this is where the impetus of the whole story revolves around. Trigger warning, there is child prostitution in this story. That is born out of boy bordellos that were popular during the 1800s in Manhattan and other cities around the world, I'm sure. I don't focus so much on the sex work that these young boys were involved in, but do know that part of the story does deal with a boy bordello, where they dress up as young girls and are there for the affections of men. So that is also in the story. The road ahead is kind of like we're going to just look at what happens to this quartet of Joss, Will, Rebecca, and Jacob, how their search for Thomas is not what they think, and it doesn't pan out the way they think it will be, and what part Tionaga plays in it. He seems to be the villain, but you find out very quickly that Tionaga is actually very gray. He's battle-weary, he's tired, he's been in the thrust of it for well over 500 years, and he just wants it to be done. So when you're in that kind of position and you lose perspective of what you were in the battle for, it kind of adds a new element. Do they trust him? Can they rely on him? How much of what he is put out there to do will affect them? So that's a big part of the story as well, and of the whole saga. Trust and fear are the two main themes in the story. There is a romance pairing between Jacob and Rebecca and Will and Joss. So there's not a lot of on the page sex kind of stuff. I do more of a fade to black, but I do want to bring out those elements in the relationships because they play a factor. Love is obviously one of the fighting pieces against fear and the trust issues that this whole saga raises. It's presented as magic, but it is deeply rooted in quantum mechanics, physics, and fringe science. My husband has a background in that, so that's where I'm kind of working from. He worked for NASA and JPL. So I do have, input into that world and can draw from it to create my science fiction native saga. This is kind of my Lord of the Rings, but with natives as the focus. While it does concentrate on Haudenosaunee culture, you actually, because what happens here is that, and it's part of a history that is not so well known, but at the Treaty of Paris that was established when the British lost to the Americans during the Revolution, Britain had told the Haudenosaunee people that they were going to bargain and barter for an establishment of an Indian nation on the continent. At the last minute, they reneged on that. Nobody's really clear why, but they reneged on it, and it never happened. In my world, it does happen, and it happens in a big way. Because the Guardians are as powerful as they are, they can defend the expanding realm, and other nations begin to see the value of signing on to the Great Law of Peace for the Haudenosaunee. They put their war clubs down between them, and they realize together they are much stronger. So while it starts out with the Haudenosaunee culture, I go the full gamut. There is influence from my characters down into Mexico. So the Aztecs defeat the Spaniards. Go figure. Some stuff is going to be really different. But I wanted to see what an evolved native nation would look like. So that's part of the story as well. So that's the road ahead. That's kind of the roadmap for this book. I hope you'll be intrigued by what I've presented here. I'm going to do one of these each week for the month of November, since it's Native American History Month. And I hope you'll join me for subsequent episodes. And if people really like them, maybe I'll continue to do them going forward, and I'll talk about natives in media and such. But this is kind of my first foray into doing YouTube videos. So subscribe, leave comments, let me know what you think about what I've proposed here and what I'm doing. Pick up the book. It's with NineStar Press. I also run a podcast, Were Podcast, that is an amazing show where we talk to queer content creators across all spectrums of queer media. Not just authors, but musicians, screenwriters, playwrights, So we try to talk to everybody and give them a platform, a voice to talk about their works and why they're so passionate about it. So I highly encourage you to go check us out, rowpodcast.com. It's in all the places where podcasts are available. You can reach me on my website, sacollins@sacollins.com. I'll include social media links in the comments below, and also how you can reach me on my email, sacollins@sacollins.com. So until next week, have a great week. And, please go pick up my book, NineStarPress.com, Were Mohawks Bearing Gifts, also available at Amazon and all the other usual places you buy books. All right. And if you want to help me out, mention the book to, buyers in bookstores. See if we can get it picked up there. Okay. Never hurts to do a shameless plug. All right. Talk to you soon. Take care.